This is Voicemail, the Universal Postal Union's podcast covering the wonderful world of mail. I'm your host, Ian Kerr. How can posts help in the fight against illicit trade? Well, joining me in this episode is Jeff Hardy, Director General at the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, or TRACIT. We talk about the damage illicit trade causes, the risks it poses to society and to economic development, and some of the initiatives that are being put in place to clamp down on global illicit trade. Joining me on the line is Jeff Hardy. Jeff is Director General at the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, also known as TRACIT. Jeff, welcome to the UPU Voicemail podcast. We ask all of our guests, what is your first memory of the post?
Well, Ian, first of all, let me say thanks for inviting me to join this podcast. It's a real honor. We've been working with the UPU quite a bit over the last couple of years. And so it's a real opportunity to speak to, some of their constituents. But, it's an interesting question, but I actually have an answer to that. I have a really early memory of the post. My next door neighbor, when I was a little kid growing up, was retired postman from the U.S. Postal Service. And I used to go over to his house and listen to stories that he told. He was just my favorite person, and I always wanted to be a postman just because of him. So that's my earliest story. But you know what? I was thinking about that. There's a little bit more to it. I remember my mom telling me that, it was illegal to open someone's mail and disrespectful. You should never open anyone's mail. And I've always remembered that. And I think she was trying to tell me how important privacy is. And, I've thought about that now that I have kids. I've passed that story on to my own kids. And if they get something in the mail, I proudly put it on their desk. They got mail. And I don't open it. I don't question it. I want them to enjoy, that great story that they got something in the mail. But as a parent, you start to think, well, I wonder if there's something dangerous in there, or who did that come from? And it's still, the golden rule is the privacy aspect of it. But there is this aspect where at what point do we balance privacy with security? And, I'm not making this story up, but it fits perfectly into what we're talking about today. It's that, the rule is you don't open that post, but at some point, is there a point that we need to protect ourselves?
It's a profound question. Where does the boundary exist between privacy and the need for security? Why don't we just start off, though, with a discussion about what TRACIT is? So it's a relatively recent initiative. I suppose, well, as we've just hinted, the trade in illicit goods is hardly a new problem. So can you just expand a little bit on what TRACIT's mission is, its mandate, and then the sort of the purpose that drives its creation?
Yeah, well, you're right. Illicit trade is not new in any way. It's been around for a long time. I think what's new, or newer at least, is that it's rapid growth in the size and the number of products that are being traded, the quantity of products that are being traded across borders, the scope of products that are being traded across borders. That's what's new, not illicit trade. And that's one of the main reasons that we created TRACIT. We really feel like there is a need for greater capabilities, for a wider scope to fight the problem. I think the second reason that we created it, at least, is because, there are commonalities in the way that illicit trade, occurs. And we're talking about illicit trade in counterfeits and smuggled tobacco or alcohol, pharmaceuticals, even pesticides, petroleum, illicit trade in wildlife, forestry products. I mean, the scope is enormous. And as we started to look at some of the sectors, we realized that there are commonalities in the way that these products are traded. There's similarities in the people, the criminal groups that are behind it. There are weaknesses in the supply chain that enables these products, to be traded, right? Free trade zones, for example, e-commerce platforms, mail carriers, express, maritime shipping. These are all legal and critical parts of the global supply chain. That's how we get a legal product from one place to another. But those are also vulnerable to exploitation by these criminal groups. And what we've found over and over is that some of these same weaknesses apply. There's weaknesses in the way that governments try to enforce put regulations in place, or try to enforce those laws, or penalize those criminals, or even educate the end consumers. So our approach was, let's kind of take a more holistic approach to the whole thing. Let's look at this illegal trade across all the different sectors. Let's look at those common vulnerabilities, and let's see if maybe we can do something, where if one act that we do might benefit more than one type of illicit trade. So that's why we put TRACIT together.
What kind of regional differences are you seeing then? You mentioned all these different categories of goods that might be traded illegally, illicitly, cross-board, or even within regions. What are you seeing any differences between the regions?
Yeah, I think so. But if I say there are differences between the regions, I could say there are differences between countries, there are differences between states, but at the same time, it's all the same. I hate to say that. At the UPU, for example, we did this survey. We'll probably talk about it shortly, where we looked at how illicit trade was occurring in 5 of the different regions there. And the commonalities were almost exactly the same. Sometimes the type of product differed a little bit more counterfeiting in one region, maybe a little bit more wildlife trade, trade in illegal ivory or things like that in another. Certainly we see in the sourcing side of it, there are regional differences between countries or regions that have a wealth of natural resources, such as fish or rare types of wood, or petroleum or minerals that are illegally exported out of their countries. So we see differences there. On the consumer side, a lot of it's the same. Because the criminal groups are counterfeiting so many different types of products, everyday products like shampoos, or electronic products that everyone uses. Even the least developed countries are more and more starting to use, mobile phones, for example. So on the consumer side, it's anywhere and everywhere, the criminals can sell the product. So I don't think it's the regional differences that matter so much. It's that illicit trade has grown hand in hand with globalism. And, as the world, the commercial sector has done a better job of, diversifying its productivity and getting one product from one side of the globe to the other, creates more and more opportunities, more and more vulnerabilities, like we talked about a minute ago, for the criminals to kind of crack in there. So I tend to look at it as a global problem, with certain similar aspects than something that, I can chop up region by region.
So then when you look at I should ask this as a question really, does illicit trade affect things like socioeconomic development of communities? And does this even fit into this concept of sustainable development as well? Is illicit trade taking something away from communities instead of allowing communities to be sustainable?
There's no doubt that illicit trade undermines achievement of the sustainable development goals and takes away from development, let alone sustainable development. That illicit trade unfairly impacts lesser developed countries than more developed countries. And a minute ago, I was just talking about globalization, for example. You have, sister organizations to the UPU inside the UN family, like the UN Conference on Trade and Development or the World Trade Organization. These governance bodies are trying to make sure that everyone benefits from global trade. Our standards of living have increased significantly over the last 20, 30, 40 years because of the efficiencies of trade, because, one country is better at growing corn and another country is better at, assembling car parts. That's how, globalization works. So the objective is, how can we make trade benefit everyone? And what I'm asking the UPU to do, what I'm asking the UN to do, is step back a little bit and think how illegal trade is actually working directly against those objectives. It's draining money out of global GDP. It's robbing countries of legal jobs that pay reliable salaries that enable companies to offer insurance programs, for families. And then we looked at lots of other aspects of sustainable development. There's people who consume illicit alcohol that's poisonous, or illicit pharmaceuticals that don't have the intended medicines in them. They're vulnerable to health risks. And that's an important part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is improving global health. There are a lot of other goals of how we protect life on land, such as, rare or becoming more rare rhinoceros and elephants and certain types of fish that are harvested out of our oceans. How do we protect life on land? How do we fight climate change? The fact that there are all these illegal products out there are really sort of clogging up the system and, detracting from a country's ability to grow and develop.
Earlier, you mentioned the wide variety of things, goods, I suppose, that can be trafficked illicitly. Would you say that there are any main industries affected by the move of illicit goods and services? And you mentioned before that the post can be a channel that's used. So what are the major channels used, and how much is our network, the Global Postal Network, involved?
Well, there's, Ian, I think there might have been 2 or 3 questions in there. Well, let's start with the industries and the sectors. I mean, you'd be surprised. It's, again, back to the top of this conversation of why we started this. The food sector is vulnerable to illicit trade. It's sometimes called food fraud, whether it's end products that land on your table that are tainted with inferior inputs or ingredients, or whether it's, illegal smuggling of commodities like, chocolate or cocoa or sugar. The alcohol sector, there's enormous amount of illicit trade in the alcohol sector. Some of the industry studies put that at 1 in 4 bottles, 1 out of every 4 bottles. You've probably even read yourself news stories from certain countries. People drink this stuff and they die, or they lose their eyesight, or they go to the hospital. I'm not going to, go into every single one of these, but illegal harvesting of fish is that's a major part of our global food chain, right? Illegal forestry. Some of our member companies are in the agrochemical and pesticides industry. That helps us grow, our food stock. Those are very vulnerable to illicit trade. I mentioned petroleum. We do a lot of work in pharmaceuticals. Some of our companies are pharmaceutical companies. Smuggling of tobacco. I mentioned wildlife, and virtually every product you can imagine has been counterfeited. So those are the sectors that we work in. There are other sectors. Just to transition over a little bit to the UPU. There are other sectors of illicit trade that the UPU has been concerned about for many years, and particularly narcotics. At TRACIT, we don't deal with narcotics specifically. The UPU and the Postal Security Group are concerned about narcotics, arms, a bomb in a box. Some of those security things that we were talking about at the top end. TRACIT looks more at the commercial side of things. Those types of industries, like I mentioned, like illegal pharmaceuticals. That's where we bring a little bit of a different perspective to the table. The Postal Security Group has been looking at, this form of illicit trade. And I think mainly our pitch to them was, you're doing some great work in protecting postal customers from perhaps a hazardous end result. While you're at it, we want to draw your attention to the fact that illicit trade in many, many other sectors, perhaps less risky than a bomb in a box, but that these other sectors present, challenges, concerns, risks to the postal users, risks to postal workers, and costs to the global postal infrastructure. I mean, there were reports that are being done by the OECD. I don't have the exact number, but I mean, that's more cost. That's more burdens, on the sorting. That's more burdens on the security. It's more burden on the distribution and delivery of the product. So there's a lot of reasons, to get the illegal packages out of the system.
Let's move on to the idea of combating illicit trade. So what are the most efficient mechanisms and tools to combat illicit trade, and how does TRACIT leverage these, and what role is there for partnerships as well in all of this?
A lot of it rests with the government. And even though I'm a business association, I don't want to say there's not a role for business. There's certainly a role for business. That all of the companies that are members of TRACIT are investing enormous amounts in securing their supply chains, in knowing, who those customers are, who the sellers are, improving the security. But from our perspective, it always comes back to the fact this is an illegal activity that's being conducted by criminals in almost every instance. And so, like any other criminal activity, most governments have put in place, some type of policing body, to protect the rest of us. And that's where we concentrate, is how can we make governments more effective? Is there some way they can learn from each other? Is there some way Australia, you mentioned you're from Australia, could learn from France in terms of, a better way to run a postal system? I know the idea though, so one of the things that we do is that we publish reports, we look at best practices, we try to share those things around. In other words, sometimes we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Some of the governments already have good regulations in place. So we try to promote a better regulatory environment. We try to encourage governments, to invest more in the enforcement of those laws. You've gone to the effort of creating those laws. We need more enforcement here. One way to ensure that there's better enforcement is to, do better education, to point to the harms, to point to the losses, to point to the health and safety risks, to point to the negative impacts, as you said earlier, on sustainable development. It's that if we can reach governments and thought leaders throughout government and show them, how illicit trade works so negatively throughout the whole economy and society, maybe, they can prioritize enforcement here. Maybe they can raise the penalties on these criminals, to try to, deter them from doing it again. And there's a number of ways that we go about doing that, but that's for the most part, the tools we actually use. You mentioned partnerships. Well, that's exactly, what takes us to the UPU. Is there something that we've been doing in terms of, quantifying the problem and the scope, like we talked about before, showing where the harms are and who's harmed? Is there something that TRACIT can bring to the table that might help the UPU? And is there something that the UPU can do to help us with our overall mission, which is just to shut down illicit trade across all these product sectors? That's sort of what brought us all together. And that's what the partnership's all about. And I think, better risk profiling data and things like that. So in my opinion, there's enormous value to partnership, whether I'm partnering with other business organizations or government organizations.
A lot of postal operators listening to this will say, all right, well, we want to do something about this. We want to protect our staff. We want to protect our consumers. We want to help, we see ourselves as playing a community role as well. So what can postal operators do to support, not just open and fair trade, but also prevent the move of prohibited items at the same time?
Well, there's quite a few things that they can do, but what's great about the collaboration that we've had with the UPU over the last year or so is that it wasn't us telling them. This collaboration started with us and the secretariat there at the UPU asking the regional operators, what is it that, what's your wish list? What is it that you could do better, or that the UPU could help you with, or that the private sector could help with? So in the end, we kind of come up with this collaborative list of things that we should concentrate on. And, first and foremost, one of them is starting off with increasing awareness. And, that's why I was really so happy to do this interview, because really understanding, the scope of illicit trade beyond what a postal worker might normally be used to is a big first step. Understanding the awareness, the harms of the economy, society, security. But we're also setting out to improve the standards, data exchange. I think 60% of the RDOs all mention that there's insufficient amount of data for them to do internal risk management. Lack of awareness throughout the global post system is one thing. So improving that awareness, improving the accuracy of data. I mentioned insufficient data, but some of that data is accuracy. So how can we do a better job of being more accurate in what we collect? A lot of the area that needs some work could be on improving the capacity. So doing some capacity building. There's a greater need for digitalization throughout the global postal system. A number of the national postal services, would love to have greater IT systems, greater data exchange systems, and even some more physical technologies like X-rays, and a better way for them to improve their inspections and other types of interventions.
So, Jeff, just in the time we have left, can you tell us a little bit about the MOU that has been signed between TRACIT and the UPU? So what are the objectives of this new MOU, and what's its expected impact on securing the international supply chain?
Well, the MOU is Ian, that's a fancy word for how we can work together. The whole concept of public-private partnerships, we're the private side, UPU, and the Postal Service are the public side. It's really growing importance as the way the UN does business. And so the PPP, the public-private partnership, really more than an acronym these days. It's the way that we get things done. It's recognizing that different people, different organizations bring different things to the table. And, we've established our expertise in illicit trade, and, your constituents clearly are the ones that, deliver the mail around the world. And it's an excellent collaboration for us to concentrate on, like I said earlier, one of the number one areas where illicit trade is growing. And that's the exploitation of the global postal and parcel service. But also, it's not just the national post, but also the express carriers. And we're talking to the express carriers as well. So the MOU gives us a basis to collaborate with each other, such as doing the survey and the recent policy paper that we studied. And it helps us kind of, create a roadmap for how we can work together. Now, I mentioned some of the specifics that we need to work on, but the overall MOU really just enables us to concentrate on things like raising awareness. It gives us an opportunity to look at what standards are currently out there in terms of security and decide, maybe what might need to be improved. I think there are a lot. I mentioned best practices before. The MOU allows us to look at best practices, share best practices. It gives us an opportunity to maybe do some pilot programs, which I'm really excited about. This is a great opportunity for us to go in and look at how illicit trade happens in those countries and how their postal system is abused, where those products are going, and see if we can make some changes. So it enables us to look at some pilot projects, maybe develop some future proposals and ideas together. And go back to that whole thing with the SDGs. Implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals is the roadmap for all of us, and we're really committed to that and working with UPU on that as well. So the MOU ties together quite a few things for us.
Now, if anybody wants to find out more about TRACIT, the website is tracit.org, TRACIT.org. You can go over there and find out all about the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade. Jeffrey Hardy, Director General at the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, thank you very much for joining us on the UPU Voicemail podcast today.
Thank you, Ian. It was a real pleasure to join you and share some of our views.
You've been listening to Voicemail, the official podcast of the Universal Postal Union. Subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast platform and you'll get each episode downloaded to the device of your choosing as it's released. My thanks to the team at the UPU for their help putting together this episode. I'm your host, Ian Kerr, and I look forward to your company next time on Voicemail, the podcast of the UPU.